So before we actually get started building our shoe panels using procedural operations, I wanted to just go over the primary tool that we're going to be using and kind of help you get your head wrapped around the steps needed to actually build the panels. Now, as you can see, I have a torus already made, and I've scaled it down to roughly the size of a shoe. And we also have an image map just with some lines to act as guides for us for building our shoes. Now, with this technique, we actually are just going to be building curves, and those curves will be filled with polygons automatically using MeshOps. And those filled curves will be wrapped around the UV map of your object. In other words, it will adhere to the contours of your object utilizing the UV map. And let's just take a quick look at this UV map, and let's go here, texture, and we can actually see the actual images that we're using as a guide. Now you might be asking yourself, well, why don't I just use background constraint and build a curve along the guide and just do a closed curve and then fill this curve using the mesh operations? Well, the problem with that is that this curve is built in 3D space, and the fill tool really only works if a curve is built on a 2D plane. So in order to make this work, we have to build our curves two-dimensionally and have them projected back onto the surface of the torus here using the UV map coordinates. So it's probably easier for me to show you than it is to explain it. So here we go. So I'm just going to clear this mesh here. Actually, I'm just going to delete it. We'll remake it. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this UV map here, this UV map, and I'm going to make actual geometry out of it that can reside in our 3D viewport, so I can use that as a guide by which to build my curves on. And that's easy enough to do. We'll just go up to here to texture, go to convert UVs to mesh, and it's going to ask me which UV map and what I want to call it. Now, as you remember, you can have multiple UV maps on any one object. So since this is the only UV map on this object, it's called texture, and I'll call this UV torus mesh and click OK, and there you go. Now you can see it created a two-dimensional plane that we can use as a guide, and of course we have our image also mapped onto that plane as well. So you can actually select that as geometry, but again, we're simply using this as a guide, a reference for us to build our curves on. Now the next thing I want to do is just close that down. I'm just going to move this panel over to the side just a little bit so it doesn't interfere with the torus. All right. And now I want to go up here and I want to make another item layer. And this layer is going to be where we're going to put all our procedural operations or our MeshOps. So I'm going to open the MeshOps viewport, and I'm going to go ahead and add a UV transform. And it's going to ask me for my target mesh and which UV map I want to use. And that's all there is to that. If you look real closely, the MeshOp for the UV transform created a little bounding box, and that bounding box is the zone or the area by which you will need to build your geometry if it is to be transformed onto the UV map of your object. Now I need to match up this bounding box to this background here, and so the way I do that is you can't actually just grab this and move it because it won't respond to any kind of translation. The only way you can move it really is using UV offsets here. So I'm just going to click here and just drag my mouse up until those two just kind of line up. So the next thing I want to do is actually add another layer, and this is going to be where I'm going to draw the curves. Now I'm not going to put a mesh operation on the curves. I'm going to put the mesh operations on here, and we'll call this MeshOp. I'm going to add another MeshOp here, and this one's going to be called Merge Meshes. And what that simply does is it takes the data from another layer and applies mesh operations to that data without actually imposing itself on the layer that you're pulling the data from. So, and I'm going to click that. It's going to ask me for the sources. I'm going to add a source, and the source is going to be the curves, and that's all I really need to do on that. So now there's a certain order that these have to go in. So the merge meshes has to be first. So it's going to look for the curves, and then it's going to perform the UV transform on those curves. Now, as far as the UV transform goes, I'm going to do a little bit of a push, like about a 0.25, a quarter of an inch. And the reason I do that is because sometimes the span between the vertices on a curve will sink beneath the surface of the object that you're trying to conform to. Now, the next thing I think I want to do is go ahead and split my viewport. And the reason I want to do that is so that I don't have to keep zooming in and out on both objects here, back and forth, to keep seeing what's going on. So I'm just going to click on the viewport, the extra viewport panel, open up the options panel and click independent so that I can simply align the torus in that viewport and line up the plane that I'm going to be using as my reference in the other viewport. All right. Okay, so I'll go to the curve layer and I'll go ahead and grab a regular curve, and I'm going to draw them in a counterclockwise direction. And this is important for the fill function to work properly. And we'll go there. In fact, might just do a mesh constraint. Yeah, let's try that again. Now, if your mesh constraint isn't working properly, chances are you might want to make sure that handle constraint is selected. And let's do that. Yes. Now, if you look closely, you can actually see the curve being built here. And I'm going to go here and I'm going to make it a closed curve, and there we are. Now, the offset here might be a little bit much, so I'm going to go back to my MeshOp layer, go to my UV transform, and I'm going to drop that down a little bit. As you can see it dropping down as I lower that. Now you can actually go below the surface if you're not careful. So there we go. All right. So that's that one. Let's do another curve, shall we? And we could actually do it on the same layer if we want, or we can make another layer and just add it to the MeshOp. But since we already have this layer active, let's go ahead and make another curve. And you don't have to, you can use any curve type you want. And I already have closed on, so that's fine. Not a big deal. Now, when you're building curves, remember, if you need to add a span between something, say here and here, and maybe I need to add a control vertice right there. Select this vertice, then select that span between the two, and that will give me that. Okay, as we can see here, we've got that curve built as well. Now, we do want to fill these curves. How do we do that? Well, we'll go to the MeshOp layer again, and this is the layer that's performing all the magic for us. We want to do a fill curve. Okay, so I'm going to add, I'm going to do fill, curve fill, and there it is. However, the curve fill has to go before the UV transform. Okay, there we go. Now you can see we've filled each of these curves with geometry. Pretty slick, huh? So now if I want to edit these, let's go to polygons. Let's go back to the curves and polygons, select that polygon. There we go. A little bit tricky sometimes. Now watch. Let's say I want to just move this up. And look at that. The curve fill works beautifully. Now suppose I wanted to move this whole curve around. Let's just do it a simple move here. Now, because I'm recording my screen, my response might not be as quick as if I weren't recording, but it's usually a pretty fast operation. Okay, and so this is basically how this tool is going to work for us. So again, with the MeshOp layer, we have merge meshes, curve fill, and UV transform. So we are taking this curve, we're having this operation look at what's ever on this layer and pull it in, and then it's going to fill that curve, and then it's going to transform that fill and the curve onto our mesh UV map. So that's it in a nutshell. So let's move on and build our shoe.